agricultural mechanization is a very key pathway to improve the sustainable development and the rural livelihood in the Asia Pacific. So that's our mandate and our vision. We have a very close relationship with China. So we have several platforms. One is a senior high-level dialogue. We can find the common constraints and problems. We are learning Chinese expertise to formulate the national strategies for agricultural rural development and agricultural machinery to help them. And also capacity building platform. We organize study tours or training courses in China and outside China to exchange their views.
IFAD was the first financing institution back in '81 who provided loan, an international loan to China. China is not anymore simply a recipient of financial institution. It's also an important contributor to our financial resources. It's one of the main contributors of IFAD financing. It's an important member of our governance. And I would really consider China as a partner to promote the global development issues of common interest, like rural development, rural transformation, but also South-South cooperation. And I think that the cooperation, the partnership in the next 40 years would probably continue along this line, along the lines of equal partnership.
The United Nations took root in China 40 years ago this month and has since blossomed into a sustainable network of agencies, programs and funds. Together, China and the UN have collaborated domestically on fighting poverty, for example, but also internationally on projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative. What have been the most significant outcomes of the UN's work in China over the past 4 decades? And what's the vision for future cooperation? To find out more, I'm honored to be joined in the studio by His Excellency Nicholas Rosellini, the UN Resident Coordinator and highest level representative in China. Ambassador Rosellini, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you back in the studio. So, 40 years of the United Nations here in China. Looking back at the past 40 years, which are some of the most important moments or fruits you would pick out now, you would highlight now as the crystallization of the collaboration between China and the United Nations?
Well, 40 years ago, China was in a very different situation than it is today, of course. 40 years ago, I think something like 97% of the rural population lived in poverty. Today, it's well under 2%, and probably by the end of next year, it will be more or less zero in terms of rural poverty. So I think, to me, this is the thread, unifying us from 40 years ago to today has been the extraordinary success of China in reducing and almost eliminating extreme poverty and in really adding to the services available. I mean, health and education services. And one can see all the social indicators, the human development indicators have also gone up during this period. And over this time, the way we've collaborated with the Chinese government has changed. When we first came in, there was a lot of direct support. There was, taking into account the situation of the country 40 years ago, there was food aid. We were supporting with the agricultural reforms. When one looks a little later, in the 90s, there was the support to industrialization, capacity development, and so on. And nowadays, it's really moved into a much more of a policy dialogue and policy exchange.
If I would ask you to pick, for instance, one example, one project, or one way of collaboration, because just now you talked about either providing direct aid or policy exchanges or technical assistance. If I asked you to give some concrete examples, which ones would you pick?
Well, I think one area we worked on from the beginning was on rural development and supporting smallholders, improving agricultural productivity, improving livelihoods for farming families. And that has been a characteristic that has continued even to today in some of the remaining poor counties in China. And many of the UN agencies have worked on rural development in terms of looking at the crops, how to improve productivity, how to get farmers to market, their goods to market, and how to generate agro-processing and other livelihoods in rural areas. So that's certainly one example.
Yeah. Why would you say this would be the most representative of the most important to highlight here?
Well, I wouldn't say it's the only important example. I mean, for example, the health agencies also trained something close to 500,000 medical workers and doctors during that period, which is also very important. But I think if one looks at the condition of the rural economy 40 years ago and the fact that we were able to contribute to the country's reform and opening up in the rural sector, I think that is important.
Well, China was a primarily agricultural society back then,
exactly.
Although huge demographic shifts and economic shifts have taken place over the past 40 years. So now, what is the priority of the United Nations work with China? Is it still on these subjects that you mentioned, or is the relationship constantly shifting?
I think it changes over time. I mean, we are driven by the needs of a country, and we want to respond to whatever the current issues are, the current priorities are. So at the moment, for us, what is important is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and that's about eliminating poverty, it's about protecting the planet, and it's about bringing economic and social progress and prosperity to everyone. And so what we're working on at the moment is very much about poverty reduction and inequality, about the environment and climate change, and a new feature which is emerging now is international development cooperation with China, and supporting China and other partner countries in their collaboration on development in other developing countries.
Would you elaborate a bit more about this new feature, new dimension to your cooperation with China? You mentioned international development cooperation. Exactly what do you mean by that, and what are some of the concrete projects that's been undertaken?
Well, of course, China has been involved in South-South cooperation for a very long time, I think since the 50s. But more recently, it's been interested also in working with multilateral partners such as the United Nations and its agencies. And there, I think what we have to offer is our knowledge, institutional knowledge and local knowledge of the partner countries, that we have our presence, our footprint across the world in all developing countries. So we see this as a very useful partnership that brings together China with another developing country, and with the expertise of the UN. So in a way, often China's providing hardware, and we can provide some of the software in terms of capacity development and training and things like that.
Are you talking about projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, or more broadly China's South-South cooperation? How important and how much of a challenge it is for the UN and China to work together under the Belt and Road Initiative to deliver benefits that's in line with international standards as well as environmental standards around the globe?
Well, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is certainly one aspect. I mean, we also are looking more generally in terms of South-South cooperation beyond Belt and Road. But for us, the Belt and Road is important. If you look at the SDG gaps, and there's been some costing of the financing gap for achieving SDGs, it's extremely large. I mean, some estimates put it at $2.5 trillion to $3 trillion per year. And we're talking about many countries which are not attractive to international finance. They need to improve their infrastructure, they need to industrialize, they need to invest in social services, but the ODA they get, official development assistance, foreign aid, is not enough. And on the other hand, the private sector investment is not coming in because of the situation in their country. So in the case of the Belt and Road, I think this is a new opportunity that can really help some of these countries bridge the gaps they have in terms of SDG finance. What the Secretary General has said of the United Nations, he said that the Belt and Road Initiative can be an accelerator for the SDGs, provided it's implemented in a sustainable way and follows principles of sustainability, social and environmental sustainability, and also is aligned with the kind of investments that the SDGs need.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of opportunities there for Belt and Road to
Well,
do
the
that.
Belt and Road, I'm going to press you a bit more on that, because the Belt and Road Initiative has been there for 6 years.
Yes.
So we have been talking about opportunity, potential.
Yeah.
Is the United Nations seeing more evidence to support the opinion that there is great potential in this program, in this project, to help countries around the world achieve sustainable development?
I think the initial impetus of the Belt and Road 6 years ago was more commercial. It was about trade and investment, which is very important for many countries, and for China, of course, to expand global markets and to support globalization. I think more recently, there's been much more interest to see how the Belt and Road can be implemented in a sustainable manner, and how at least some of those investments can support some of the indicators within the SDGs. Now, the SDGs include goals and targets on industrialization, on infrastructure, as well as on the social sectors such as health and education. So they're very much compatible. And the recent Belt and Road Forum did make very strong statements about compliance or convergence with the Global Compact, principles for responsible business, and with the SDGs and sustainability. So I think we're beginning to see at the policy level and at the planning level that strong direction in terms of sustainability. Now we need to see that translated into specific projects and activities.
Yeah. How do you look at this fact that China, being still a country that still has extreme poverty, it still has very uneven development and a lot of areas that needs to be developed, and yet China has taken the step to go out and assist other countries? Of course, China also wants to reap the benefit in that process. How do you look at this, have China taking up such a role? Because we're not talking about other developed countries with higher per capita GDP going out and doing similar things.
Yeah. Well, I think there are some differences. First of all, it's very important that China continues to focus, as it is doing, in terms of the elimination of poverty inside China, and to continue to improve the quality of development inside China, and I think it's doing that. But if we look at China's position in the world, it's a developing country, but it's also the second largest economy in the world. It's also the largest trading economy in the world. And for China, I think that needs to have a strong relationships across the world. And I think it's of benefit to China as well as to the partner countries if there are investments in infrastructure, if there are investments in industrial activities and employment creation that can promote stability in those countries, it can promote growth, and if it's done in the right targeted way, it can also promote human development and as well as economic development.
Yeah.
So I think the two are complementary. They're not competitive with each other. I think it's quite possible for China to continue to improve the quality of life of its citizens, as well as contributing to the global public goods, which in turn will benefit China in terms of increased economic activity in the world.
What has the 40 years of partnership between China and the UN meant for the United Nations? Has there been a sea change as well in the relationship there?
Well, I think it's changed over time, for sure. If we look back, the types of projects, the types of activities we were conducting with China 40 years ago are quite different from the ones today. I think if one looks back to the 80s and maybe into the 90s, it was much more about technology transfer, about direct support for various activities. I mentioned already about food aid. I think nowadays it's a very different relationship. A lot of it is looking at as China in the context of global partnership with China, because after all, China is not just about, our relationship isn't just about development, it's also about China being an important member of the United Nations.
That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LA. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.